amazing video. Thanks for coming to my session and spending your lunchtime with me. I think I can cross off my bucket list speaking in a cinema room with people eating sandwiches. I don't think a lot of people can do that, so thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about the AI native dev coding workflow. I assume your coders somehow, in some capacity, were entering into the AI native landscape. This picture, every time I give the talk, the horses become a little bit more robotic, right? But the kind of, person who actually sees it, it's also a little bit more like the four horses of the apocalypse. So we don't know where it's heading, but I'm going to give you, I think, is a good lunch session. There's going to be lots of slides, smooth. You don't have to think, but it's a lot of story flowing. Going to take you back, beginning of the year, when I made this deck. It was all about the tab completion, AI, GitHub Copilot, right? We've been there, I assume. Although at this conference, I asked, do you have any AI agentic coding tools? No. And I asked them, do you have AI, GitHub Copilot? Yes. So it's confusing to people what is actually that coding tool. So it could be as simple as suggestions in your tab completion. Then our lives got changed with ChatGPT, and we started like copying and pasting things from the chat into our code. Very tedious, very kind of annoying, and you have to read all the stuff. But then our IDEs got better. They kind of made like multi-line suggestions, so it wasn't that simple thing. It was a cool thing to add. It even could predict, like when I'm editing in the editor here, your next task as a developer is going to be editing here. So it's always predicting our next job of the things that we need to do. Like this is a next edit suggestion in Copilot or others have that. And then it wasn't one file or multiple lines. It became multi-files that it started suggesting. So we're kind of like, OK, now what? Like where is our attention going? And it didn't stop there. Then it kind of looked at our terminal and got the feedback back from our terminal, and we started copy and pasting things into the chat from there. And then it looked at our browser to get feedback of the browser, and then improve the coding as well. So you see, it just keeps expanding, and it's amazing to have this kind of scene grown over the years. Then it wasn't just about the code. It started creating the tests, one of the chores that we kind of always struggle with to do, and AI was helping us there. And then kind of the tooling landscape changed. There's been a lot of talk about MCP services, whether that's like clicking around or kind of doing our end-to-end tests for us. Kind of a new step in that direction of our IDE. So big kind of spectrum of things happening. Then all of a sudden, the IDE wasn't sexy anymore. We all had to be in the CLI again, console, right? Headless. And it was kind of churning out code without us seeing it. And then he came back after a period and said, hey, here's the code. So definitely another shift in the spectrum of coding with AI for us developers. I kind of make this picture. We thought it was about the LLM, right? Then we had RAG. Nobody talks about RAG anymore in coding. And it moves on to functions. And it's just like, you see this expansion almost up to the layer where you maybe heard some talks, or it's going to be a team of agents that collaborate, and they have all the different knowledge that we need to do. And then ultimately, and I think one of the presenters just said it today, ultimately, the agents then will start to code themselves what they are missing, right? So I know this is a big spectrum, but it's one of the reasons why I actually entered back into looking at coding with AI. I have an engineering background, but I see it almost like the ultimate thing where we are heading, the agents coding the things they don't need themselves to improve themselves. Now, I've been curating the landscape, so if there's any interest, I know a lot of people always like, oh, what's the next shiny tool, and what did you discover? If you want to keep up to date, you can go to this website. I think I started the year with about 150 tools. We're now close to 500 tools in the ecosystem, right? It just keeps exploding. Those are only tools about coding with AI. It is not putting AI into your product. So it's clear that that field has exploded over the last year. Now, new technology brings new roles, right? And the nice thing is I do not have machine learning background. I do not have all kind of the machine learning engineering, but I can play with this. Why? Because I'm an integrator. I've played with, oh, I'll take an LLM, I take some data, I have an API to the endpoint, and I bring those things together. So while people on LinkedIn might proclaim they're now the expert, and kind of a lot of people are looking for a new job into the new wave, right? Everybody's kind of an expert. So, including me, that way, right? So I kind of help people overcome usually if there's a new technology kind of adoption and try to make that. I was there with serverless, mobile, DevOps, even the internet. So I enjoy this period of chaos. Some people might not enjoy that chaos, but I think it is about stretching how far we can get. The downside is that there's going to be so many tools, things will come, other companies will come, and you don't know yet. But that's kind of where I kind of try to give you a little bit of a compass of where kind of you might go as a developer and conceptually look for a few of those patterns. You can find me on LinkedIn. Also, I have a lot of slides. If you're interested in the slides, send me a message on LinkedIn and you get the whole deck so you don't have to continuously take pictures of all of my slides. So cloud native, right? We've had now heading into AI native. And what happened with cloud native is that just people sprinkled some cloud on that and they moved every machine to the cloud. Now, the same thing is happening with AI. We are now AI native. What does that mean? I honestly can't say where we're heading, even though I study the field so closely. It's changing roughly every 4 or 5 months. Like, it's not like maturing. The concepts are kind of like changing how we think about this space, which excites me, but it could be really tedious for people to kind of follow that space. So I created a framework in my head to think about this. And I think if you're starting to code a lot more with AI, and it's been mentioned a few times, you become the reviewer, right? You become the manager. So you're not the producer, but you're actually the manager as such. So I'm going to give you some examples. I'm actually going to not talk too much about code generation, but kind of what the effect is of code generation being done by AI. We now have to review more code, right? That is putting a cognitive load on the developer, right? It wasn't that single tap completion. It was all the files it could generate it. So whatever we gained from productivity on creation now slows us down as such. Now, the diff view, I don't know about you, but it's not the easiest way to review what the code actually does, especially if it gets bigger and bigger. The chat view is also not very helpful, but because then I have to read all the stuff. So I want to highlight like a small tweak that one of the tools did is they took actually your code, but they started putting annotations on what has happened in the code migration. Instead of doing the diff, instead of doing the chat, they're kind of annotating that code. So what I'm saying is that it's all good to have code generation tools, but we need to work better on that review tools as well. We're slowly getting there. I'm going to show you some hints. I'm not saying this is polished, but this is the next part that we need to take care of. And why does it need to be just text? This is a product. It doesn't exist anymore. That happens in the AI space. But the concept is it shows you a visual diff, maybe of a diagram, which is way faster to grok what the difference is compared to reading lines of codes and looking at nodes and kind of errors in text. So that's another way of kind of making it more attractive to see what the change was. Our friends from Google had the idea of, if it's generating so much code, why don't we turn it into a podcast? And I know you're not going to listen to a podcast while you're driving back to work. But it's a nifty idea of why doesn't it summarize it in text and tells us what it actually changed. They're just showing off their notebook technology. But the concept is it could be text, could be image, could be voice as well. And this brings me to the concept of a moldable editor, a moldable thing that our editor is likely going to change to something that is better suited for reviews. Now, this is a very generic concept, but you start seeing this in editors or kind of orchestrators who are much more optimized for reviewing what the coding agents did compared to giving the instructions of what the code should look like. One of the things that might help is while having the conversations, there is now a concept called MCP UI. Instead of just having text, it allows different pieces of the MCP services to actually inject similar snippets of interaction with the user. I'm not saying this is a perfect review system, but you see there's something moving for the review and making it more visible in different ways than just a div or something like that. Now, it's all good to have kind of those review sessions. What we really want is to say, the AI just commits. So Aider is one of the CLI tools, which was probably one of the first that said, I'm just going to auto-commit if I feel so sure as an AI. Ooh, it feels very uncertain for us. No, it didn't push. No, it just did the commit. So it's still relatively safe, but it saves us the time to do the commit. But when it did the review, it's fine. Now, we're struggling to find that balance, whether that is actually should be committing or not. And that's why you see more and more in the systems checkpoints. Similar to your sandboxing, your containers or something, all those kind of coding tools will say, I coded up until here, checkpoint. Next week's checkpoint. And what that allows you to do is to roll back to a safe environment, safe context, like we would do actually with Git or something else. But then while the agent is executing, it needs a checkpointing system as well. This brings up a whole different thing of us reviewing and allow other people to touch certain pieces of the code. This is, I think, Windsurf, if I'm not mistaken. He has the option to say, please lock this file so AI cannot change this. Right? Maybe that's your README, maybe that's something else. But you start seeing kind of that like identity access management that you have to do on your code because people are accessing it and you're not the person doing it. And then you also have to worry about costs. Like, what are the tokens burned? Should I use a smaller language model? Should I do it in batch? All the things you never thought about as just a coder. And my claim, and maybe some people know from my DevOps background, we're all ops now. For the old people like me that remember the war files and the jar files being thrown at operations, operations has never seen the coding, did not know what it did, and we had to put in production. That's exactly how you feel, right? The coders have been doing stuff, and they tell you you're responsible for it in production. So I'd say that was kind of the first pattern. You're going to move more into kind of that manager operational role, saying yes, no, we're worried about costs, and kind of maybe less on the producer side because the coding agents do that. Now, the next thing is, up until now, we've been managing what the agents have been doing and the implementation. We say yes, no, and so on. We want to move a step earlier. We actually want to say, this is what we want the agent to build. So instead of kind of going in and doing like worrying about the implementation, we want to worry about the intent. What is the code supposed to do? And then the agents start doing the coding, and we come back in that reviewing mode. So some of you might have put some intent or kind of guidelines for the agents in maybe your cursor rules or equivalent of Copilot and others. It's a way that you express intent. My directory structure is like this. This is the feature I want to build. So this was a very light way of a specification, or a very early way. There's now standardization by agents, right, that allow you, before you had like a Gemini.md, an OpenAI.md, and they're now all going for agentsmd. It's good to have some standardization. So people put stuff like the cursor rules, but now you can reuse it across different agents. Helpful. And then people start saying, well, if I'm pasting that prompt over and over again, why don't I create a markdown file from that? And I just use that markdown to actually say, reuse that prompt. A very simplistic way, a very crude way to make like reusable prompts or kind of part of a specification you want to do. So the point is that we're moving a little bit away from the chat and kind of direct interaction to here's the intent, break it down, here's the spec, break it down into a plan, and then do the coding. So towards intent-based coding, and one way to do that is actually writing those specs as well. People have been exploring what that language should be. Should it be more structured? Should it be completely natural language? I think the jury's still out. This was a project called SpecLang from GitHub, where they kind of experimented with different kind of flavors to do that. And now today, they have something called an experimental thing called GitHub Spec Kit, which is basically kind of you writing your markdown files in a specific structure. A couple of months ago, AWS Kiro, which also had a talk and a booth here, they kind of came up with the fact that let's streamline this a little bit in our IDE. And you can see in their IDE, they actually ask you, do you want a vibe code or do you want to do it like with a spec? So they kind of change that directly, or they put that like directly visible. They've used a pattern called ears, which is kind of closer to BDD style, where you ask it to do things. Now, what they do, their kind of spec is what I would call like a planning spec. And it was mentioned in the previous talk as well, where you'd say, this is the feature, it's almost the ticket that you want to do. Please go implement this. And so what you write in the ticket is almost like the spec and the requirements that you want to have. But there's a flip side to that as well. Like when you generate code from a spec, sometimes you want to go from the code back to the spec because you're still a developer. You can do certain things easier, right? And it's one of the things the company I work for at Tessel, where we keep a close relationship with the spec, saying, well, it's all good to have the requirements, but this requirement actually goes into that file. This requirement goes into that test file. So we keep it like a closer relationship. Is this going to look like that in like 6 months, in a month? I can't even predict. But it is kind of that closer relationship that we try to keep and to allow you to do more syncing continuously. So not just for one feature, but the specs actually stay in your project. And this has two benefits. A lot of people, when they have a chat with the agent, they close the window and then they lose all that context. There are some people that say, well, after the session, please save this to a markdown, and which is great. It keeps the context. So your agent, when it restarts again, it doesn't have to ask all the questions, and you don't have to provide all that information. So the specs as a markdown are very readable for the agents and optimized for the agents to do a better job. But it also helps to align humans. If you have a document in your project that actually explains what you were building, instead of just your code, the new person that comes in can actually read that code. So he's faster aligned to actually what your team is doing. Or when a person leaves your team, the knowledge is still maintained in the specs. So it's not what they've been prompting all the time. So that's one of the advantages of spec-driven development to do that. And this was a picture I found where they say, like, OK, you have prompt engineering. There's been quite some talk about that. Then it's context engineering, what goes into the context window. And if you put a layer on top of that, it is intent engineering. And one way to express intent is to use like specs and use spec-driven development. If that's something that interests you, there is a talk by my colleague later who will go deeper into spec-driven development. It's at 3 o'clock in room 10, if you want to attend. So this was pattern number 2. So not only managing the agents when they do it, we get better at expressing what the agents need to do. Now, how do we actually figure out what they need to do? Which is typically the role of the product owner who says, well, I looked at all the features today or this week, we're going to implement that. But as I will show, they will have to worry less about the delivery. And we've been working hard over the last years about like the continuous delivery pipeline. But it is in their role all about discovery new things, discovering what the user wants, discovering concept that we want to bring in, or kind of what will make money. And I'm going to take you into Lovable, and it's been mentioned a few times here also as one of those vibe coding tools, fast prototyping tools. The product owners love it, right? They can express what they actually want. So it's almost like executable specifications that they kind of write that. I've seen a few talks bash this, like, oh, it's a prototype. We're professional developers. We know better. Of course, you know better. Like, you've done it for years. But it does help them to express things. So would you rather have something that I battle tested with a prototype or just kind of a document that I've written up and they dreamt of, right? So this makes it more tangible, and that actually is helpful for us. The word vibe coding has gotten a really bad reputation, especially amongst professional people. It's full of bugs. And my argument is, as an ops, I've seen also many ops, and we're humans, right? And I've seen people delete databases, yes. And I've seen all the mistakes done by AI as well. Does that make it bad as a vibe coding? Would I put it in production? No. This is the engineering scrutiny. So I wouldn't say this is a bad thing because we all make mistakes, but it's about how having that safety. And then you get the idea, okay, vibe coders and prisoners and so on. But the bad reputation is because we think they're doing a bad job. Actually, the problem is us thinking that the job is about the coding. The job is about the discovery of things, what we should do. And that is the real value of the vibe coding. I do that as well. If I need to figure out what I want to build, I do a series of vibe coding because it helps me understand, oh, that actually makes no sense, that feature, or the button shouldn't go there, or it's not usable. That's kind of the intent. So that generation of a website, and you can argue, oh, don't put this live. But what if it creates choices that I can learn from? This is very simplistic. 3 choices of a different website. I learned, and I say, oh, this is actually something I like. Try to express that in a prompt, what you actually like, without looking at options. Really hard. And if you take that to the extreme, what if our users could actually figure out what they want? So their vibe coding on top of our platform, and that is our A/B testing. I know it's a stretch, but they're discovering what they actually want. They give that feedback back to kind of a product owner. They are not running our prediction systems, but they kind of can explore and express their features better. Just want to plant that idea. I've shown you the 3 kind of different websites that were created. There's a certain pattern emerging within that discovery is I want to do parallel things. And there's 2 reasons probably why you would want to do things in parallel. I want to have a feature done faster, very similar to, hey, I have my backlog, please break it down into features. I'm going to have multiple developers working at the same time, and they need to merge back. The problem is, if you would ask that to an LM, is actually not that easy to break it down to tasks that are actually separated. We can work on that, but it's definitely a reason why people would gonna do things in parallel. The second reason is I want to have multiple variations of things. The website is one example, but what if I say, can you come up with 2 or 3 different algorithms to implement this? Come back to me tomorrow morning. I'll kind of judge it. Can you look at 3 ways to improve performance? Go at it. So that's the exploratory discovery that is also part of the vibe coding. It just accepts, but we learn from it. Like we had exploratory testing, because a lot of people initially believe when they're starting to testing, I'm going to write all the tests. It's impossible. You have exploratory testing for things that you're discovering while you're doing that testing. The same thing here is with vibe coding. You're vibe coding because you're discovering actually the business features or how you want to build this, or maybe the technical way to do this. So that's your learning. I typically would do this maybe for 1 or 2 days. The prototype, the whole technology grinds to a halt. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't react anymore. I don't care. Then I start back from scratch. But I learned what I actually wanted to build. That is the value of the vibe coding for developers as well. And then people have been trying multiple ways to do that parallelization. They kind of use Git work trees, which is popular, and it was one of the blocks from Anthropic. You create almost like a fork, but a local fork on your system, and the agents work on different directories. Okay, that could work. You see again the need for snapshotting. When I roll back and I do multiple things at the same time, you want to go back. Some people have been using Juju as a lighter weight GitHub snapshotting locally. So they use Juju locally, and then obviously they push remote. But it's an easy way to roll back and do different snippets. The other way you can run kind of those things more safe in parallel is to use a Docker container. And you have an MCP service called container use that we say, oh, I want to implement this prompt. It takes your GitHub, it starts doing that in a container, and then it comes back to you with the result. So it doesn't pollute. There's less kind of chances of it changing, deleting other files on your system as well. And then we have Alex's tool, right? BacklogMD, there was a talk earlier today, and that is what I mentioned about breaking down those tasks of the parallel things and kind of keeping track, almost like your Kanban board, dealing kind of all the tasks that you want to do in parallel and make that more visible. So I can recommend to check it out to do that as well. And so what you'll see is that I mentioned the review system as the manager. I have this parallelization as doing things. So now you see a whole new breed of tools coming up. The coding orchestrators. So what they do is they actually have 7 or 10 different sessions working at the same time, reporting back to you, maybe through a Kanban board, and then you give them hints while they're doing. It's almost like dealing with a team of developers that you're giving hints in the morning, you did a good job, please roll back here, this was not good. So different way of working. And I've seen at least one company that completely rebranded their tooling to being an orchestrator. So there's a big market coming in that piece. And then Devin, you might have heard a couple of years, maybe 1-2 years ago, they're completely headless. We use that internally by saying, oh, that's a feature we don't want to have too much brain cycles on, or we're not sure where this is heading. Just hand it over to the agent, comes back as us in the morning. Oh, it was okay, let's do it. If not, note that we're still doing the review, but it's kind of a way of spinning off multiple things that we want to do. So this was the third. Do the discovery of IDs. Then you know what you want to do, the intent. You give that, and when they're doing, you're doing the review. So the order is quite annoying on the picture, but it's the 1, 2, 3. But what you ultimately want to do is all the things that you do, you want to capture that knowledge. You're learning, but you also want the agent to learn. And that's where it might produce a lot of code, a lot of context, a lot of specs, but you basically want to turn this into knowledge. And that's the 4 pattern. Now, what's context? You might have seen this in your editor. You bring in a file, a remote file, maybe a terminal. That's context. That's fair enough. People have been writing coding identities by saying, I'm a great front-end developer, and they give it a backstory. It's also kind of some context or content that you give it. And then, for example, what we do is we take libraries and we convert the libraries into specs, like React or Express or Spring or whatever, and we turn those into specs. So that becomes content of how to use a certain library, right? Useful when you're coding as well. And there's other pieces of content, like your release notes is one, your outage, your API docs, all content. Your incident response, all content. Well, hopefully you can learn from those. So what if we can feed those to the agents and they actually read the report, and so we don't have that outage again. And all that content that we're collecting is actually really great to have people learn things. And I touched on that a little bit with specs, people reading things. But what if they can ask questions about your code base? right? Why are we doing this? Do you remember why we implemented that? And they have some Slack, they have a ticket, they have maybe an outage, and they can see that all together. Try that in the company right now. Pretty impossible. Now, what you see for that knowledge and that documentation to become useful for agents, we have to think about the agentic UX. So not the user UX, but the agentic UX, right? And it is, can you actually call your tool? Is it documented how to call the tool? Because otherwise, it will just guess. It's as humans. If there's no information about it, and it's a very bad API, then it will not work. So I urge you to also make your own internal tools more AX friendly. And it could be as simple as, I don't know if any people here know Bun, kind of the modern alternative to NPM. You see, for example, they have a setting to, well, we're running Bun, but we're running it for an agent. Claude code equals 1. And that actually shows different output than for a human. So very subtle thing. Now we capture all the features that we're building, right? Either in the spec or this was a very early one. Somebody just putting it in a change log and making that as a kind of markdown file to kind of remember that. We could actually, the agents could help us to do that if we ask it like, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? Here's an example of Deving saying, I think this is important, what you ask it. Do you want me to save this as knowledge? So it's in our flow. It's not like something we have to do after our feature is finished and then we write the documentation. So that's kind of leading to more knowledge. It still needs kind of like updating the knowledge and making sure it's up to date. But while you're using it, you'll likely say, oh, it's out of date. Please update it. And the agent does the update. And then if you think about it, it was all good about us learning and different team members learning this at the same time. But what if your agent learns from the other agent? What if they're not repeating the same problem again because somebody else in your team solved it? So kind of that memory of knowledge is probably one of the last things. Specs is almost like the precursor to knowledge management in your agents to do that. And there's like tools like Memory Bank, MCP, who are also you can already plug in, and they kind of keep up to date knowledge of that pieces. And then today there was also a very allusion to Claude Flow. Like, what if I have multiple agents starting up as a hive or a swarm? They share the knowledge. They kind of, one says it goes into a knowledge. So this is very experimental, and it can be great or not great, right? So the problem is with these long-running things is that the review, which I mentioned as the first pattern, actually increases very high. So I like to keep it like, longer than a day? No way. Like 7 agents at the same time? I can't cope with it as a human. So maybe when we get better at pattern 1, we actually might get better at kind of dealing with these agents as well. And then the agent can, of course, use all that knowledge to maybe solve your GitHub request or a question somebody else has that isn't in your company and kind of put that into a knowledge base there as well. And then we're entering a new world. Now we have to monitor our agents, right? What is the agent doing? What is the one agent telling to the other? Is it not saying stupid things to that thing? Do we need to have a code of conduct for agents that they can't do strange things? I don't know. Fascinating stuff. So I hope this gave you a little bit of a context of thinking wider than code generation. And the way that I would explain this kind of picture is by saying a good senior developer cares about the things that run in production. So they got a little bit of an operations background. They do care about design because they know it needs to be reusable. So they go a little bit into QA and architecture. They do care about what feature to build and not blindly build the features of the product owners, but they do care about it being the right feature. And they do want to write knowledge so your colleagues and others can actually learn from you what you do. So in essence, this is amplifying us, senior developers, to do a better job at the broader context in a company and not just focus on the one code. Now, the new developer workflow might be something like this. I specify my intent, I go into my backlog, it plans stuff, it does a bunch of parallel coding, I do the review, and then while it's doing that, it learns all those things. This is, note, a local flow. I didn't even merge anything back. So a lot of people are doing the CI/CD workflow on their laptops now, right? So people ask me often, how do you think DevOps will evolve? I don't know until this settles. And then I can think again on how DevOps will kind of work again. So I'll leave you kind of with that flow and think about it. If you're interested in that stuff, I mentioned we have a website, AI Native Dev, where we do podcasts and articles and interviews with people. We're also running an event, and I know this is a little bit far for most of you, but it is in New York. But we do live stream, and you can watch that from remote as well. And we are focusing specifically on things like specs, reviews. So yeah, I was the curator, so obviously it matches a little bit of the structure of my talk. And that's it. So if you're interested, you can contact me, go on the website, or join our community. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.